Welcome to possibly the worst idea I've ever had. Tell me, have you ever opened up Genshin Impact, ready to play with your favorite character of all time, just to have them...
Everybody stand back! Inazuma shines eternal! Rain cutter! See? Game's up. Time's over.
Well, I'm here to fix that. Welcome to solo DPS. Tired of your characters being on field for only a few measly seconds? Today, we're gonna change that. My goal is to see how far certain characters can make it into the Spiral Abyss by themselves. The rules are as follows. I will first start off by listing off what the respective character excels at, the correct way of playing them, and so on. I will then proceed to show off my, let's say, unique builds. We're basically gonna take your healers, your shielders, supports, and we're gonna give them a gun. We're even gonna take your DPSs and give them an even bigger gun. Anything goes, so long as they are the only character I use. Is this gonna be annoying? Of course it is. Is it gonna be fun? Probably not. Is this even gonna be possible? Well, I don't actually know that. I'm recording this in advance, so some characters may be incredibly easy, while others are... well, we'll get to those. As a disclaimer, I'm not a professional by any means. My goal is entertainment first. So please don't expect these builds to be 100% optimized. And because I'm not a complete psychopath, I also don't have every single weapon and constellation in the game. So just please, chill out. Regardless, please feel free to comment down what character you would like to see next. And while you're at it, I'd appreciate it if you could give this video a like, and maybe if you're feeling especially nice, you could even maybe subscribe. These videos are going to take me a long time, and I'm going to be basically ruining my account by possibly building a DPS Kale or something. But anyways, without further ado, let us begin with our first character. Nahida is the premier Dendro support. Her strengths lie in her massive amounts of both on-field and off-field Dendro application, as well as some unique traits associated with her kit, which I will explain soon. Players using Nahida typically tend to go for a 4-piece set of the Deepwood Memories artifact set, due to its buff to Dendro damage as well as its massive amounts of decrease to Dendro resistance for the enemy. As for Nahida's playstyle, her normal attack isn't really anything too special. It's just a simple 4-piece attack string, and due to her being a catalyst user, she only has the ability to deal Dendro damage without any outside help. Her E skill causes Nahida to mark up to 8 opponents, dealing damage to them and making it so that any elemental reaction is inflicted upon every other marked enemy as well. Her burst creates a large area of effect, which increases the active character's elemental mastery based on Nahida's current elemental mastery. This area also has a few different interactions based on how many elements are in her team. As for weapons, Nahida players typically tend to go for either Magic Guide and Mappa Mare for lower investments, Sacrificial Fragments for later on, and those free-to-play players who might not have gotten a higher tiered 5-star weapon. And obviously, her signature, 1,000 Floating Dreams, is her premium weapon. That's all assuming you're going for a support Nahida, however, which, while the most common way to build her, is far from the only way. The unique thing about Nahida is that there really is no set way of building her. Sure, most people opt for support Nahida due to her insane boosts to elemental mastery, as well as her Dendro application and her burst. There's a lot of reasons why support Nahida is as strong as it is. However, it's definitely not unheard of for someone to have built a DPS Nahida. So with that all out of the way, here's the plan. I chose to keep her with the obvious Deepwood Memories set. This is mainly for the boosted Dendro damage, and since she will be the only character on the team, boosting her Dendro damage is going to be very, very important. However, instead of having triple EM for her stats, I went for a more DPS oriented one, going for a Dendro damage goblet, as well as either a crit rate or crit damage circlet depending on what weapon I choose to use. As for the sands, I stuck to Elemental Mastery. Though Elemental Mastery isn't as effective when she's by herself due to not having access to whichever element she wants to at any given moment, it will definitely still help to take out those slimes and elemental oriented enemies. However, you could very easily go for a simple attack sands if you want, just for more raw damage. For the weapon, I'd recommend the Mappa Mare for you free-to-play players in case you would like to follow along with this challenge for whatever reason. It may not be the best possible weapon for her, however it is still definitely usable. It increases your elemental damage by a decent amount, and it gives you that little bit of elemental mastery you may have gotten from your artifacts, allowing you to more reasonably switch over to an attack stance for more balanced stats. However, I will be using Solar Pearl, just due to its higher stats. I already know this challenge isn't going to be easy by any means, so I need all the help I can get. And I will also have a Kagura's Verity on standby just in case things go south. These are my final stats while using the Solar Pearl and a crit damage circlet, and these are my stats while using Kagura's Verity and a crit rate circlet. So with that all being said, we can now begin the challenge. My goal is to beat the first 8 floors of the Abyss. And if you're sitting there asking why I'm not doing floors 9 through 12, well, people struggle clearing those floors even with a fully built team. Look, I'm sure it's possible with some characters, but I'd rather upload this video in a reasonable amount of time, and with my sanity at least somewhat intact, okay? For floor 1, I'm sure this doesn't really need to be said, but it was very simple. All 3 chambers are really just made up of slimes and hilly troll enemies. So once inside, we pick the most offensive options for our choice of buff, and we begin the chamber, quickly realizing that a level 90 character really does mow through waves of level 25 enemies. And while not a hard chamber by any means, it is incredibly satisfying. It was pretty much the same thing for Chamber 2, everything went down in about 1 hit. However, one thing to take note of is these shielded hilichurls who seem to block 100% of any damage they take.
I see everything.
This type of enemy is very annoying. Normally, you would want to use an element that takes these shields down. In this case, it would be Pyro. However, for this instance, we can simply wait until they move their shields down or get ready to attack. And finally, the mid churls also pose no threat to Nahida, as she managed to one-shot both of them at the same time. Chamber 3 was arguably easier. We took another attack buff and began the challenge. Normally, when playing Abyss, taking the elemental burst buff is incredibly useful. However, in case you're not yet aware, Nahida's burst doesn't actually damage enemies, instead just buffs other characters on your team, so there's no reason to really up its damage. And once again, everything in this chamber died very quickly, so there's not much to say. Floor 2 wasn't all too different either. Similar enemies, just at a higher level. And this is going to be something you're just going to have to get used to. I mean, did anyone really expect the fully built character to struggle against these low level enemies? Chamber 1 was full of more electro slimes, though one thing I noticed was that the large slimes were now able to tank more than 1 hit before being defeated. Chamber 2 was the first defense challenge. However, in case you're new to the game or just living under a rock, Dendro absolutely shreds through any Hydro enemy, and that includes Abyss mages, so once again, this chamber was no issue. And because of that same reason, Chamber 3 was also a breeze. I can't tell you how much I struggled against Hydro Abyss mages before Dendro came out. Floor 3 is where we would run into our first real problem, or at least a foreshadowing at one. 90% of Chamber 1 was really nothing special, to be honest. Throughout most of it, I actually second-guessed even making this video to begin with, since everything was going a bit too smoothly. That was until the final enemy had remained. It turns out that Dendro really struggles against cryo enemies, even at this massive level difference. I could not for the life of me take down this thing's shield. It took quite a long time, however, once the shield did go down, it was only a few hits until I managed to defeat the actual slime. Now let's just hope we don't run into too many of those in the future. Chamber 2 was also quite easy, though I did start to get a little bit annoyed just due to the sheer amount of treasure hoarders this game threw at me. I eventually learned that the best way to deal with them is to just take out the ranged enemies first, but like the rest, they all eventually went down. I was originally a little bit worried about Chamber 3 since it had a Ruin Guard, and my experience with Ruin Guards had never been too great. They're very tanky and deal a bunch of damage at the higher levels. They are some of the toughest enemies in the game in my personal opinion, but that may also just be a bit of bias on my end since I am a Eula main. Anyways, yeah, no, this Ruin Guard was not that tough. Floor 4 was full of Helichurls and Hydra enemies, so you can probably guess how that went. Chamber 1 had a ton of enemies, but due to most of them being Hydro Slimes, I was able to make enough Bloom Seeds in order to defeat all of them in basically an instant. Chamber 2 was another defense-based challenge, and while again not difficult by any means, the enemies did manage to land quite a few hits on the monolith, which kinda worried me a little bit. As for Chamber 3, it also wasn't hard at all. However, I was starting to get worried at how many hits this Metatroll was able to tank through before I eventually hit him with a Bloom Seed. If you've played Genshin up until this point, you'd probably know that beginning on floor 5 of the Abyss, the game forces you to create 2 teams as each chamber has 2 sides to it that must be completed in order to move on. The issue here is that a character can only be used once per side, so I will be doing 2 runs of each floor with Nahida on each side, while I use just a random team on the other. For the first half of floor 5, it's... Oh no. You remember floor 3, chamber 1 with the large cryo slime? Yeah, well, I was like, oh no, that was sure difficult. I hope that doesn't happen again. And then Hoyoverse says, hey, you remember that one enemy? What if we give him 5? This chamber was incredibly annoying. Every single large slime in the game starts with a tough ice shield, which can normally be taken down quite easily by various elements. Hell, even physical damage can take it down somewhat. You also have to keep on moving because this many slimes, even at this low a level, will shred through your health. I did almost die at a certain point, however, I did manage to just barely complete the chamber. Oh, and now you're probably sitting there saying, oh, that wasn't so bad. At least the tough part is over with. Yeah, no. Health actually persists through chambers. I just hadn't mentioned it yet, and since the damage I took before it wasn't anything life-threatening, I'm about to die. Anyways, Chamber 2 was a bit tougher than I would have liked. It was nothing compared to the previous one, obviously, but now more than ever, taking out the crossbow users was the most important thing because otherwise they would continue to pelt me until I die. I took quite a bit more damage, but I was able to complete the chamber eventually. At the start of Chamber 3, as I was given my choice of buff to take, I took a health up. Normally, I would take more damage regardless of my health. However, Nahida can't exactly deal physical damage, so it was better to take one of the other 2. And the game ended up giving me an easy lineup of enemies that went down very quickly. So that happened. For the second half, Chamber 1 was fairly simple, though unlike Hydro, Nahida doesn't absolutely demolish Pyro Shields. However, it's not as bad as Cryo by any means. And in my opinion, Pyro Abyss Mages are the easiest to dodge as they have very slow attacks. Regardless, they both eventually go down. Chamber 2 was essentially the same thing as the first half, just a bunch of treasure hoarders. However, this was a little bit easier since they had a pyro aura around them instead of a cryo one, allowing Nahida to actually get some reactions in. Even if the burning reaction isn't exactly the most powerful, it helped nonetheless. And same thing for the third chamber. It was quite an easy one as well. Essentially take the same things I said about the first half, but put a pyro agent instead of an electro mage. And now, floor 6. Unfortunately for us, this floor continues on with the trend that the previous one set. Cryo on the first half and Pyro on the second. For Chamber 1, I knew this entire floor was going to be tough as hell, so I opted for defense throughout the entire floor, as it would help mitigate a lot of damage I would inevitably take. This chamber was full of Cryo Whopper Flowers, Cryo Slimes, and Crossbow Hilichurls. Just pick the most annoying enemies, won't you? One of the major issues I started noticing at this point was my lack of stamina at practically every single point, since I'm forced to run away from basically every enemy, as well as charge attacks being a large source of damage for me. It was tough to manage how much stamina I actually used, which led to me taking a lot of stupid hits. Not to mention, the Whopper Flowers are so goddamn coordinated. The slime, yeah, sure, it just slowly approaches me and occasionally jumps. That's fine. No, the Whopper Flowers change their strategy on you, from blasting you with cryo attacks to just randomly teleporting in front of you. I did eventually manage to beat the chamber, but I was basically on life support at this point. Chamber 2, oh god, how do I even begin to talk about this one? And here I thought Hilly Trolls couldn't be all that bad. I mean, they all go down in one hit, right? Nah, we have Cryo Archers, Electro Archers, we have Shielded Hilly Trolls, Shielded Mida Trolls, and near the later half, we even get the Geo Shielded variants of both of them, which are functionally the same, I get it, but you cannot convince me that they're not stronger. But you may be saying, oh, it's not that bad. Yeah, well, the game also throws a goddamn Cryo Abyss Mage at you. Why the hell would you do that? And that thing, paired with the Hydro Somatros, which I also failed to mention, are a deadly combo, since if you get frozen even once, you're dead. I cannot tell you how many times I died trying to complete this. And due to my poor gameplay during the first chamber, I was basically at half health throughout all of it. I had to pull out all the tricks in the book. I abused my bursts as iframes, which if you don't know, while using your burst, you literally cannot take damage. So I had to use that during times I knew I would get hit. Eventually, I even used the Hydro Somatro against the other enemies. Since it creates a small area of Hydro, I was able to go into it and create a few bloom seeds. But that was also very dangerous since if I kept them alive, the Abyss Mage could just freeze me. But if I didn't, I couldn't deal enough damage to defeat the other enemies fast enough. And that's not even mentioning the fact that I was out of stamina throughout all of it. You thought Chamber 1 was tough. If you don't move for even a second in this chamber, you just get ganged up on. The Mida Trolls will charge at you, the Abyss Mage will spawn Cryo Shards on top of you, and the Hilly Trolls will shoot you from afar. Did I mention they're Cryo as well, so they also have the ability to freeze you. All the while, the Hydro Somatro also just heals them up. So keeping it alive isn't even all that helpful if you can't use its power to your advantage fast enough. If you kill the Hilly Trolls too fast, you get overrun with a ton of Mida Trolls, or the Cryo Abyss Mage may spawn way too early. I contemplated giving up on this one, truly. However, I did have one more idea. You remember what I said earlier in the video? And I will also have a Kagura's Verity on standby just in case things go south. Yeah. It was time to pull it out. I wasn't even sure if it would help all that much, to be honest with you, but it was at least worth a try. So I had to redo Chamber 1, this time making sure not to get hit as much, allowing me to retain as much health as possible for the next chamber, as I would need it. And once there, I eventually came up with a new strategy. I would wait for the Mida Trolls to charge at me, and once finished, I could follow up with an attack from my E skill. This was the most reliable way to damage them. It wasn't a fast strategy by any means, but it had to be done. Once they were gone, the challenge became significantly easier. I picked off the rest of the enemies and left the Cryo Abyss Mage until the end. Once again, its shield took an absurd amount of time to break, but it eventually did, and I had completed the chamber, though once again with very low health. For Chamber 3, I was basically forced to take another health up instead of damage, and after a few easy enemies, I was greeted with a stone lava churl. However, to my surprise, Nahida was able to actually damage it without breaking its shield first. I still had to abuse iframes and dodge carefully, however. This chamber basically turned Genshin into a Dark Souls boss with the amount of dodging I had to do. But it wasn't all that bad, and I eventually did take it down, completing the first half of floor 6. Now we can finally move on to the second half. And once we start, we notice...
Everyone hold hands.
Yeah, basically just take everything I said for the first half and replace Cryo with Pyro. I mean, I managed to beat the Cryo half. I don't think this needs to be said, but this was significantly easier than that. Chamber 2 got a little bit interesting. I was originally very worried that it was just going to be an alternate version to the first half with a ton of difficult enemies. And it kinda was that, but lucky for me, Nahida didn't seem to struggle as much here. The scariest part was really just this one time I got trapped in an Animo Samatro's vortex. I took quite a bit of damage, which unfortunately put me at a bit of low health going into the next chamber. But we continued. Chamber 3 was a ton of Pyro Slimes and 3 Pyro Abyss Mages. Unfortunately, I made the mistake of targeting all the Pyro Slimes first, which ended up spawning every single Abyss Mage at once, and they eventually overwhelmed me. But the second time, I managed to balance out the enemies enough to just barely eke out a win. And now we're on to the Fatui floor. If you know anything about these guys, you'd know that they take a ton of damage once they put their shields up. You do not want to fight a Fatui and not have the element needed to take their shield down. And I'm just going to save you the trouble of sitting there and listening to me ramble on and on. This entire floor was incredibly easy. It turns out that each Fatui's element can actually cause reactions, and Dendro reactions are, well... The only possible issue would have been the Cryo Fatuis. However, unlike Cryo Slimes and Abyss Mages, they can actually be damaged through their shields. And due to the damage we were doing, everything went down very quickly. I was quite surprised, as I thought this floor would have been the most difficult floor out of all of them. Finally, floor 8. Once again, same pattern of Cryo and Pyro. Chamber 1 went as you'd expect. The Hydra Abyss Mage went down basically in an instant, and I was left to fight the Cryo Abyss Mage for a while. But as I've already fought a few of them, one really poses no threat anymore. Chamber 2 was a bit tougher. There were a lot of Hilichurl archers which had to be taken down in order to prevent myself from being picked off by them. And once I did, I could focus on the Ruin Guard. The main thing that made this chamber tough was really just the cryo aura around the enemies. This made it so that they were quite a bit more tanky than normal, but besides that, it was no issue. And Chamber 3 was a pain. It turns out that Dendro can't actually damage the Cryo Regisvine's weak point, so I was forced to fight this thing with his defense basically maxed out. I dodged and I dodged. I even almost died at a certain point. If it wasn't for the fact that Nahida's normal attacks could reach the Regisvine from a safe distance, this fight would have been a lot harder. And it's basically just the same thing for the second half. I'm sure you've noticed the pattern by now. I don't have to keep mentioning it. First chamber was 2 Pyro Abyss Mages, who I took down quite easily. I'd already beaten 3 of them, so this chamber was actually easier than that. Chamber 2 was the exact same as the first half, just with the Pyro Aura, which, as I mentioned before, works to our advantage, allowing us to create reactions on the enemies, meaning the Ruin Guard was really no issue. He was actually significantly easier than the first half. And Chamber 3 was weird to me. I actually thought it would be quite easier than the first, since it was an element that can actually react with Dendro. However, it turns out that Nahida can't actually damage the Pyro Regisvine's weakness either, so it was back to the occasional pelting it with weak attacks until it died. And with that, we had done it. All 8 floors of the Abyss completed, using only a single character. If you've made it this far, I just would like to thank you all for sticking through this video. This was a crazy idea I just kind of came up with, and I think I'm pretty happy with it. As far as making it a series, I'm gonna have to really think about it. As I mentioned before, these videos take a really long time to make. I did attempt a little bit of floor 9 just to see if I could get through it, and I'm sure with enough time and effort I could have done at the very least floor 9, but as I mentioned, even just editing those 8 floors took a lot of time, and I'll have to see what I can do for it in the future. So if you would like to see another video like this, or maybe some sort of variation of it, please let me know. But either way, I thank you all, and I hope you have a great New Year's.